It's the week ending Saturday the 30th of April, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Emmanuel Macron become the first incumbent French president to be re-elected in 20 years. Russia, accused of blackmailing European nations as it cuts off gas to Poland and Bulgaria, and DJ Tim Westwood departing his radio show following claims of sexual misconduct. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Kari Wilkin from Goal. It's Emma Smith, and fresh from keeping my seat warm, it's everyone's favourite Olly Mann tribute act, Arion McNicoll. And Arion, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
So this week, a blow was struck against the hard right in a European election. But no, today we're not talking about France.
People really believe in us that we're the only ones who can bring that change. From trust comes expectations. From people's expectations comes the responsibility. So today, people are dancing, and I'm waiting for you to start dancing. But tomorrow is a new day. Tomorrow, we start working hard to justify that trust. And that is our commitment to the people who have supported us today. Freedom!
Robert Golob, the new Prime Minister of Slovenia, giving his victory speech on Monday. Arion, tell us how he came to win the election.
Right, so last weekend Slovenia's populist Prime Minister Janez Janša suffered this incredibly heavy defeat in these parliamentary elections by a left-leaning party that, surprisingly enough, had only been formed in January. And the outcome of the election really did come as a surprise to many experts, especially because the last opinion polls before the vote seemed to indicate that these two parties were really entirely neck and neck. And many analysts think that the reason for the defeat is that Janša had been accused of showing really increasingly authoritarian tendencies which Slovenians had reacted against, and also that he's massively at odds with the EU, with whom he's had these really long-running rows, which I'm sure we'll get into. But the election on that basis, in conjunction with what happened with Macron's win over Le Pen in France, really feels like this vote of confidence in the EU itself.
Yeah, it's interesting that, isn't it, Kari? Because they are two different countries, France and Slovenia. And people also make the comparison with Hungary at the other end of the scale because of Viktor Orban's control there. And obviously he was a bit of a natural ally with Janša. But do those comparisons stand up? I mean, does what happens in Slovenia have anything to do with Hungary or France?
Yeah, Janša has very much been a part of this sort of nationalist and popularist surge in Eastern Europe, and he does, he's a huge fan of Donald Trump, and he's very much modelled himself on Hungary's autocratic leader Viktor Orban. I think the difference is, his defeat is that basically he overplayed his hand because he tried to emulate Orban despite never actually having had the Hungarian leader's outright majority. But, he's very much pushed that same sort of anti-EU, basically, backing commitments to national politics, deference to executive power and resistance to community or international law. So he's very much been a part of that. Obviously, each country has its own agendas, but he's certainly aligned himself to it.
Okay, Emma, and tell us about Golob then, this guy who's won. Why did he win? What was his party's pitch?
Golob is an interesting figure. He's something, as Arion mentioned, a newcomer to the Slovenian political scene. And I suppose you can have sort of more comparisons, as Arion alluded to, with the French election, in that Macron swept power from a sort of a new liberal perspective. Golob is more of a background in business. He made a successful career for himself as an energy executive, but basically moved into politics through his status as completely opposed to Janša on virtually all topics, is with an agenda to focus on environmentalism, a more open liberal society, and investment in the welfare state.
So Arion, we talk about comparisons between Trump and Janša, the predecessor, but actually Golob is the business person. Golob's the one with private money behind him. In that sense, he's quite Trump-like, isn't he?
That's true, and he had to kind of fight these accusations coming from the Janša-backed state media and vice versa. There's this sort of reciprocal relationship like the Fox News Donald Trumpian connection over in the US. So he had to fight these accusations that he was really sort of overpaid and that he'd been involved in financial irregularities and all of those things, all of those kinds of accusations that tend to be leveled against people who have a business background. But what's different about him to Donald Trump, say, is that he's very much on the sort of left-wing end of the spectrum, where Donald Trump not so much, and really his pitch to the people was that two things. First of all, he was campaigning on moving towards green energy, which is quite exciting in itself, but also he was interested in a return to the rule of law and ran on a promise to really broadly undo much of the stuff that Janša had been doing in the country, specifically his attacks on the media, and increasingly it was looking like he was then going to focus on the judiciary and go in the direction of these authoritarian leaders that we've seen doing similar sorts of things around the world.
Yeah, actually, Golob billed the election as a referendum on democracy, and you can really see why. There have been tens of thousands of Slovenians have attended regular anti-government rallies since Janša took power, and campaigners are now calling on the new government that Golob is trying to form to pass an omnibus law, in effect repealing 11 decisions by the National Assembly during Janša's 2-year term. And they include measures to safeguard the autonomy of the police and restrict legal rights of environmental campaigners. He withdrew funds from the Slovenian press agency, which had to cut 10% of its journalists as a result. And he's also, like Trump, tweeted attacks on journalists. He attacked Slovenia's constitutional court, claiming they were responsible for coronavirus deaths after judges ruled that his government's COVID legislation was incompatible with the constitution. He's appointed party loyalists to positions of social and political power. He's handed state contracts. It just goes on and on and on.
Okay, we get it. But that is all the kind of thing, the kind of caper that the likes of Orban do because the public quite like the strongman image, or liked it. Do you think we're seeing a shift here, Emma? And do you think actually the war in Ukraine may have helped Golob from this point of view? You know, this is the effect of what happens if you vote in a strongman. We're talking about the former Yugoslavia, after all.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if it's a complete move away from the strongman right-wing form of government in Eastern Europe. You see that in Hungary, Orban is still very much in control, similar in Poland. But I think that certainly you're right to flag Ukraine as a factor. Janša allied himself very closely with Putin. The television and the media outlets that mentioned that were very pro-Janša, such as Nova 24 TV, were very much also parroting Russian propaganda. So I think that that's certainly had an impact as well. While it might not be a sign of a complete rejection in Eastern Europe of the strongman form of government, I think it's proof that there's not going to be this sort of wave of Orban-like figures taking over across the region, which is what many may have thought would happen as Orban took such control in Hungary.
Is that why you chose this story, Arion, as your story of the week? I mean, it evidently hasn't been getting the same attention as the French election, but that's kind of because obviously France is more important, isn't it? Certainly in the EU, certainly now they've re-elected their president. Is Slovenia important?
Yes, in a sense, and I think that's what a lot of the media commentary has been kind of reflecting on. The attitude that a lot of analysts have taken is that this is a sign that we're heading back towards democracy in Europe, away from this push towards a sort of legalistic type of authoritarianism where someone takes power legitimately but then increasingly introduces measures over the term of their tenure to undermine both the constitution and the various kinds of checks and balances that had been in place on their power. I'm not sure that that is necessarily where things are going to go for Slovenia because, well, for one thing, it's not easy to come in and be a political outsider and then immediately take to government with the sort of A, authority, but B, confidence to introduce the sorts of political measures that are necessary, particularly when you consider that macroeconomically the same factors are affecting Slovenia as the rest of the world in terms of kind of pandemic-induced supply chain problems and all of that kind of stuff. So there's big issues that need to be solved in the first place. But also, you know, when you're trying to do it with a rookie team, that's going to be hard. So I don't know that we're necessarily looking at the beginning of the end for that authoritarian populist streak of leadership in Slovenia. But certainly it's a turn away from that for now.
Particularly, I guess, Kari, since Janša's still there, isn't he? He's going to be able to point to this new government if they can form it, because he's got to get together with other left-leaning parties to make a coalition. He can point to that government and say, well, look, I got us through the pandemic, and look, this guy's messing everything up. I mean, you can see how it could swing back again.
Yeah, I mean, a lot has been made of Golub's lack of experience. Sanchez certainly pointed to it. I think it is also worth pointing out, though, that Golub has had political experience before. He was Secretary of State for Energy in the early 2000s, so he's not quite the novice that he's being presented as. But a string of other political startups on the centre-left in Slovenia have basically fizzled out in recent years amid infighting and organisational problems. And it has been suggested that, Janša, who's just been around forever, he's been described as the Prince of Darkness of Slovenian politics. He just sort of keeps popping back up and just can't seem to be defeated. But he's been around forever, and it's been suggested he's just basically going to go away, take a holiday, come back refreshed, and then wait for everything to fall apart and jump back in again for hopefully what he would hope would be a fourth term in power.
And Arion, what next do you think for Slovenia generally in terms of their international reputation? And for a long time they were considered the sort of poster child of post-communist transition. Is that still the case? I mean, are they still the example Europe looks to in that region?
Well, I think there's hope for that perspective. I think that the premiership of Janša was damaging that, but now they have the opportunity to, rekindle some of that hope that the rest of sort of the more liberal end of Europe might have been projecting on them. But I saw a bit of interesting commentary from a political analyst called Pengov Bitenc, who said, Golub's party is a projection of this inversely messianic complex of the Slovenian nation, which is constantly looking for a messiah to solve all its problems at once. And Pengov said that, you saw a similar situation happening in 2014, and the country has been through these sort of false starts in the past. So I just don't know if this is necessarily... It could be one of two things. It's either going to be a false start and we're going to see the return after this holiday, as Kari said, of Janša, or it's going to be a brave new dawn and the country will continue to be the hope it once was. It kind of remains to be seen.
It's probably worth pointing out, actually, that, Golub faces a major challenge. There was a recent report from the US-based rights organisation Freedom House that found that last year Slovenia experienced the sharpest democratic decline in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So that's a big ask to claw your way back from that again.
Okay. Kari, you're up next after this.
Brought to you by Aria Resorts Homes, providing holiday homes and staycation investments. Aria Resorts sell luxury holiday homes in top UK locations, with a potential 7% annual net return available to qualifying investors at our flagship resort in Cornwall. Terms and conditions apply. Find out more by searching Aria Resorts Investment.
Okay, Kari, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Will an HRT czar offer the change that women need?
More women are realising that actually I don't have a problem that someone's prescribed me antidepressants for, mistakenly in many cases. It's the menopause. And so they're much more aware, but the producers have not quite caught up with the demand, or a lot of them. I mean, there is quite a few prescriptions still available, but Estrogel, for example, the gel, they've got a big problem with that, and women are literally going to car parks, handing over money to people to get it.
Jane Moore speaking on ITV's Loose Women on Monday. Kari, what's the story?
So basically, she was talking about nationwide shortages of HRT, or hormone replacement therapy products, which, as she was saying, has left some women, very desperate women, turning to the black market or asking friends to buy HRT abroad, or, despite the risk of tainted products. And there's an estimated 1 million women in Britain rely on HRT. So this is a huge problem, which was talked about by Caroline Noakes, the Tory chair of the Women Inequalities Committee in Parliament last week. And she told Parliament that she and thousands of other women were struggling to get the HRT that, quote, enables us to sleep and to work competently. And she called for a parliamentary debate to ensure women can get the supplies they need. So there's been growing calls for action because in recent weeks, supplies are running out, and campaigners are warning that some women are just being left feeling suicidal as a result.
Wow, okay, because we're not talking about just one brand here. You're talking about drugs, plural.
Across the board, yeah.
Why? I mean, how did a crisis in more than one brand or one origin of HRT drug arise? What's the problem?
There are many factors. There's COVID-related supply chain problems. Shortages of ingredients have affected the production of a wide range of medications. But HRT has been particularly badly hit because of increased demand. NHS data shows that prescriptions in England are up from about 238,000 5 years ago to almost 540,000. So that's more than doubled. And there are various reasons for this. There have been awareness campaigns by celebrities such as Davina McCall, which has led to greater media coverage around, challenging the taboo that has existed around, the change, as we coyly put it, for so long.
Yeah. So this is the message is things like, if you're feeling a bit low, you might not need antidepressants. It might be the menopause. That's the kind of message, isn't it, that's been getting out?
Yeah, exactly. There've been campaigners have, said that for so many years, menopausal women, and, the whole topic is just surrounded by sniggers and jokes and, just women having hot flashes. So they've just been ignored and misdiagnosed with other conditions. But now that awareness is growing and doctors are getting more clued up as well, demand for HRT is exceeding supply, and just no one was ready for this.
Okay, but Emma, you've spoken on the show before about delays in NHS treatments and shortages. So is this a special case? Is this worth singling out? Do you think it is worthy of a czar?
I think that there certainly is an element to say that it is worthy of singling out because, as Kari says, it's across such a huge amount of people. Nearly 1 million women are on HRT. This is an issue affecting a huge range of people and across a huge range of treatments. For trans women such as myself, I'm on HRT as part of my gender dysphoria treatment. So it's affecting a huge number of different people from different backgrounds, different walks of life. And the fact that people are having to go to these extreme measures to the black market isn't too strong a way of putting it. It's a huge issue. Obviously, it's the COVID backlog has made it worse as across a huge number of treatments across the NHS. It's illustrative of the huge strain the British healthcare is under right now.
Do you think it's true, though, Arion, that, if HRT was something that men needed, this wouldn't happen? I mean, that's kind of the accusation on social media, isn't it? That women's health gets deprioritised. You are talking about 50% of the population, so that is a big burden if there's suddenly a big uptick in people wanting it. I mean, is it really because it's for women?
Possibly. I don't think that's impossible. We are talking about a number of different causes that have led to the shortages. And as Kari said, not all of those are connected to that sort of sexism in medicine. Some of them simply are that there's supply chain issues and that's what's causing the drugs to run out. But the BBC had a really good article with some humanizing stories where they spoke to a bunch of people who were suffering with various kinds of effects connected to menopause. And they spoke to one who is Yasmin Darling, who's 45 and had had 2 operations to reduce her risk of inherited cancer, which had plunged her into early menopause. And she now has these really bad migraines. And then another woman, Claire Lopez, who's 59, said that she just cannot get her usual HRT patches from anywhere. And without them, her body becomes really stiff, which has led to slipped discs and really severe back pain. And then another woman, Tiffany Watkins, who's 37, started having menopause symptoms age 35. So this isn't something that's just affecting older women. It's affecting lots and lots of people. And I think in terms of its significance, this is a good 50% plus of the population that we're talking about. So this is a lot of people for whom this needs to be ironed out.
Yeah, it's estimated that at any one time, 13 million women in the UK are menopausal or perimenopausal. So, it's not just the million who have actually managed to get prescriptions for HRT. We're talking huge numbers of people at any one time.
But just that word, perimenopausal, that's exactly part of the kind of awareness campaign you were talking about, isn't it? Perimenopausal wasn't a phrase that I heard, on the air 5 years ago.
Yeah, the taboo is definitely lessening. But on the other hand, as Labour MP Caroline Harris, who is the co-chair of a newly formed UK menopause task force, she pointed out HRT is as important as insulin to a diabetic. Imagine if insulin had run out in this country, there'd be absolute uproar, whereas this has gone under the radar, I'd argue.
It's also, Emma, something that has to be paid for most patients, which might come as a surprise to people listening to this that have never been prescribed HRT. I know that in October it was announced women in England would only have to pay a single annual prescription fee rather than every month. But I suspect a lot of people would just assume it's free, but it isn't.
No, it's one of sort of several prescriptions which aren't free. And I mean, it's around £10 a month for these hormones, and I mean, for some people who are lucky enough to be able to budget for that, it's not an issue. But amidst the cost of living crisis, these are really important treatments that people are not being able to get for free on the NHS. And one of the factors that's come from this response to the issue, and HRTs may well be looking at, is whether or not a planned cut for prescription fees for HRT can be introduced immediately rather than for the current target date of April 2023. It's something that I would welcome, and I'm sure that most other women who are on HRT would welcome. And I think it's certainly, if that could be brought in and as part of this, it would be something that would be hugely welcome.
I think that's a really important point about that scheme to introduce a cheaper annual fee, which was first announced in October last year and was meant to begin within months, but's now, as Emma said, not going to begin until April next year. And Thorin Govind, the chair of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society English Pharmacy Board, said that delaying this move will only drive further health inequalities already experienced by women across England, and then added that they were really calling on the government to scrap prescription charges in England altogether. And on that question, as Kari was saying, Caroline Harris has long been pushing for laws to make the treatment completely free. So this is really something that Labour supports while the Conservatives seem to be dragging their heels on. And even though there are NHS supports of various kinds to offer free prescriptions for people who can't afford, in fact, pretty much all medication, it doesn't catch everyone. And there will be some people for whom this is a big financial outlay and one that they're struggling to afford because they don't meet the particular means tests that the NHS has set up.
And do you think this might be the first of many, Kari, this tsar idea? Because this is based, isn't it, on what we saw during COVID, where there was one senior person's role just to manage COVID because it was such an important health priority. But, you can imagine people would easily be saying in a few years' time, okay, well, where's the tsar for cancer? Where's the tsar for HIV?
Yeah, the HRT czar is going to be, the role is going to be modelled on that of Kate Bingham, who was, as you say, was chair of the COVID vaccine task force. And possibly, but campaigners are saying it's not enough. Don't just put some person in charge of it to go and sort this out. There need to be sweeping changes. Campaigners, for instance, are calling for law changes to let pharmacists alter prescriptions during medical shortages. At the moment, they're not allowed to make any amendments without referring the prescription back to the GP, which obviously causes huge delays. So the proposal is to let community pharmacists make changes to the quantities and strengths and formulation of HRT and other medicines that are dispensed. There is also calls with HRT for a national list of approved HRT treatments, because at the moment there's basically a postcode lottery whereby local NHS authorities only offer many of them only offer a few HRT treatments, even though women often need to try several before finding one that works for them. So you've got unequal distribution across the country, which is then exacerbating these shortages. And, all of this comes at huge economic effect. We've talked about the money involved and how not everyone can afford these prescriptions, but it's also estimated that 14 million working days a year are lost to the UK economy as a result of menopause symptoms. So this is a huge issue, and to just lump it onto one czar does seem a bit wishy-washy.
What about the whole tsar thing, Arion, from the government's kind of PR point of view? Does this look like Sajid Javid, still relatively new health secretary, of course, kind of taking control, being proactive, getting in there, finding a new solution to this problem? Or does it just really highlight the fact that this has been badly planned over many years and this was a problem you could have seen coming and the government should have been on top of it before?
I think it has to be the latter. And, any effort like this just reeks slightly of panic and a determination to find a quick solution to something that has been long in the works. And I think it's worth mentioning that our former and much loved colleague Elizabeth Carr-Ellis, who is now a menopause
campaigner.
That's right,
menopause superhero.
Yeah. So she was interviewed by the Daily Mail about all of this, and she likened it to the home front in the Second World War. She said, "It reminds me of my mum talking about the war when women would pass on where the latest ration supplies had come in." So the idea that people are having to resort to hunting around the country and finding the drugs that they need, and then also having to take things very much into their own hands, really does suggest that, this is too little too late on the part of Javid. But, any efforts to find a solution obviously welcome, but it needs to happen quicker.
But maybe, Kari, a positive change in that it is being discussed. I mean, obviously, it would have been on Loose Women anyway, but that's the only place it would have been, wouldn't it? 5 years ago. It's being discussed. It's being discussed at high levels of government.
Yeah, I think there's still a long way to go, though. There is still, the ministers for so long haven't taken this seriously. And I think as a society as well, we do tend to still, we don't really want to talk about it. I have to admit, it was only in researching what the symptoms of menopause can be that I learned just how serious it was. And, I am going to be affected by this, along with a huge chunk of the rest of the population. Came as a huge shock to me, for example, to learn that symptoms typically last for 2 to 5 years and can last for up to 15 years. I didn't know that. And surely this should be a basic kind of fact that we know. So yes, it's good that it's being discussed, but, and perhaps it's a sign I need to pay more attention. But I think it's also a sign that as a society in a whole, we need to get a better understanding of this problem.
All right. Emma, you're up next after this. Okay, Emma, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is English football's big spending culture finally coming to an end?
Fans have been waiting almost 7 hours. That deadline by the EFL for Bury to prove they had a financially viable future was at 5 p.m. So fans, as I said, here in the rain, in the cold for 7 hours, and then to receive the news that they were dreading, the news that Bury have become the first football club since 1992 to be expelled from the Football League.
Sky News reporting there back in 2019 on an event that led to the collapse of Bury Football Club. Emma, what's happened this week?
So this week the UK government has endorsed a number of recommendations made in a fan-led review on the running of English football, which came about following the collapse of Bury Football Club. And it's about the way that individual football clubs are run and their financial viability.
Yeah, now this is the thing that's been put together by the former Conservative Sports Minister Tracy Crouch, isn't it? What were her main recommendations?
Yeah, so Crouch chaired this fan-led review, and the 10 main recommendations as part of the report, one which has gathered the most attention, the main one, is the introduction of an independent regulator to have the power to licence and sanction clubs with an enhanced owners and directors test in order to try and ensure that English football clubs are owned by people who have the financial resources, financial wherewithal, and are, to use a phrase that currently exists in football, that are fit and proper persons in order to run these clubs.
Yeah, because of some of the issues that we've touched upon before with international owners and, clubs being sold to the highest prices and so on. What's been the reaction from the football industry, first of all, before we move on to the fans? How have the Premier League responded to this?
English football's been split by this. The EFL, which is tiers 2 through 4 of the football pyramid, have welcomed the reforms. The Premier League, on the other hand, are opposed to the idea of external independent regulation on their clubs. Statements from the league said that while it recognises and accepts the case for reform, it maintains it is not necessary for there to be a statutory-based regulator. Yeah,
so if we take Manchester as an illustration then, Emma, you've got Manchester United and City obviously financially doing very well. They don't like this, whereas Oldham and Bury and Bolton, who are struggling, they do like this. I mean, it's as simple as that, is it?
It's along those lines. I mean, this review was obviously sparked by what happened to Bury, as that clip said, first English football club in nearly 30 years to be expelled from the league because of financial problems. We've just had the 1-year anniversary of the attempted European Super League breakaway, in which Manchester's City and United were both involved, and which has heightened the desire of fans to see a change in governance. And I mean, you do certainly have, in the case of Manchester, the case of the haves and have-nots. I mean, the 3 clubs that you mentioned there are 3 clubs which have had huge financial issues. Oldham this week became the first former Premier League club to be relegated out of the Football League, having fallen through from the 1st to the 5th division over the course of the last 30 years amid a series of incompetence in its ownership. It was relegated on Saturday in a game that was completed an hour and a half after it should have been, after fans invaded the pitch and protested against the mismanagement of the club.
Yeah, so Kari, fans obviously always feel very passionately about the club they follow, but the system is that these clubs are businesses. So it's a bit weird to have a situation where they're sort of not allowed to go bankrupt. I mean, I know that's not what's being proposed here, but it's being proposed as a tonic for a club going bankrupt. So that does rather suggest that the idea behind it is a kind of bailout scenario. And yet, if you're running them as businesses, then bad businesses can't survive. That's capitalism, right?
But is it not equally odd that this multi-billion, I mean, I don't know the figures involved, but I know there's a lot of money involved in football. Is it not equally odd that this huge industry does not have a regulator when all other major industries do? That it's Fair Game, which is a campaign group for football reforms that's been demanding an independent regulator for years, pointed out that, quote, your ordinary banana is better protected than our football club. So I find it extraordinary that there haven't been moves before to just improve the financial sustainability and corporate governance of the national game.
But you put a banana in your mouth, Arion. I mean, that's why it's regulated, is because there are health and safety issues. I mean, I suppose there are health and safety issues of going to grounds as well. But football is an entertainment would be the answer to that question, wouldn't it? Football isn't an essential. It just feels like that if you're a fan. Does it need to be regulated?
I think that's a really complicated question, actually, not least of all because football really does matter an awful lot to a lot of people. I think a lot of people would rather eat a poisoned banana than have their football team relegated, for example. But I saw a really interesting feature by Adrian Chiles in The Guardian where he was talking about the business of football. The idea that these clubs are going to fail on capitalistic terms just isn't true because, as we all know, there's a lot of quite dubious people who are drawn to buying football clubs in the first place, and a lot of them don't see these organizations as businesses that they need to run profitably. For example, Manchester United has debts of about £500 million. Barcelona has debts of more than £1 billion. These are organizations that people buy into for various kinds of motivations that aren't necessarily the ones that you would do if you were running things purely financially. And I think that's why a regulator is being called upon to get involved here, because I suppose that's what the government sees as the only way that they're going to bring this sort of morally dubious ownership under control. But I don't think that that's necessarily going to do the thing that they imagine it will, just because so many of these businesses, how are you going to turn around Manchester United's finances in the space of a very short amount of time? Football expenditure is now at a point where it is so extreme that you can't do anything other than continue to buy your way out of a hole, particularly if you want to meet those demands of fans who have these hugely high expectations.
Well, yes, the expectations is an interesting point, isn't it, Emma? Because presumably, even though this has been broadly welcomed by fans for obvious reasons, there is an argument that exceptional quality football at the highest levels might suffer, because if you are curbing a club's opportunity to have the richest owners, the most expensive players, the highest ticket prices and merchandise and TV rights, you're limiting their ability to build the world's best team.
Yes, and I think that's why the Premier League is so opposed to this idea. I mean, there's an argument to say that Premier League is one of the great British exports and great English sort of success stories in a business terms in recent years. It's become £1 billion brand, and any attempt to sort of regulate that, sort of curb that, would be met real opposition. But the fact is that there's a need to protect these clubs and need to protect these industries, because they're more than just businesses. They are representing the culture, the heritage, the history, the identity of towns which perhaps don't have them in other factors. I mean, you look at the case of these greater Manchester clubs, places like Oldham, Bury, Bolton. You say Bolton, first thing you think of is probably Bolton Wanderers. They are so precious and so important to these places and these identities that they have to be protected. And if you lose them, as has been the case with Bury, they can be incredibly damaging to the towns as a whole. And, and I think that it's anything that is going to protect those identifiers, these incredibly important things, from the grips of owners who might range from the incompetents to the downright to the downright malicious. I think that's an important thing.
Yes, and possibly a feeling, Arion, that the genie's out the bottle. I mean, yes, okay, something like the European Super League was possibly a step too far, and that was a bit of a chastising moment for everybody. But really, football is the way it is. I mean, you can put a few more regulations in, but it's not going to suddenly become fair and equitable and all the local teams are going to suddenly be able to compete with Manchester United again.
I think there's a lot of truth to that, and I'm happy to be corrected by Emma on this, who obviously knows much more about it than I do, but I think that there's so much continued vested interest in the ongoing wealth of the Premier League itself in particular, and then I suppose maybe the Championship as well. But I think, English football is something that people have come to imagine is going to be a place where the best players in the world come. And I think that people would be very sad, fans in particular would be very sad if that stopped happening. I mean, some of the things that I found more interesting in this review were at the sort of towards the lower end of it, where there were these other recommendations that seem, if not as important as the idea that we should really scrutinize the kinds of people who are allowed to own football teams, like, for example, that women's football should be treated with parity and given its own dedicated review to have a look into how that game can be properly boosted. And also there was this other idea that as an urgent matter, the welfare of players exiting the game need to be better protected, particularly when they get out of the game at a young age. And I think that those sorts of things actually are worthy of investigation. It's just they've been so lost in this massive document that, and particularly if we're going to not see anything acted on until we have the white paper and we have the further reviews and we probably even have a football czar appointed, that nothing's going to change. And I think there's so many issues that need to be resolved at the same time. And I don't quite know where you start, but perhaps even talking about it is a good first step.
Okay, well, Emma, before I blow the final whistle, just give us a prediction on what you think the final score is actually going to be. I mean, what's going to happen, do you think, in, let's say, 3 years? Will we be looking at a different scene when we look at English football?
I think at the very top of the game, things will be largely the same, to be perfectly honest, at least from a regulatory point of view. I can't see that these super clubs, the Manchester Uniteds, the Chelseas of the world, are going to be brought to financial heel by a government regulation. I mean, and within these recommendations, there's nothing about whether owners can be blocked for geopolitical reasons. So the situation is currently happening at Chelsea with Roman Abramovich being sanctioned and forced to sell the club. There's nothing to prevent something like that happening again. So I think that what's more interesting will be what happens lower down the football pyramid with clubs like Oldham. There is now a real desire within the Football League and within levels 2, 3 and 4 of the Football League to bring in some sort of regulations and more protections, because the fact is, if you're a supporter of a smaller football club, you are aware that you could very much be next, because you don't have the millions upon millions of pounds, and you don't have the huge television deals. You're one bad owner, one bad decision away from facing this downward spiral. And I think that while the Premier League will continue to be the Premier League and continue to be this behemoth of financial, entertainment, financial entertainment behemoth, continue to grow and grow, I think that there will be changes within the English football pyramid lower down. And as a football journalist, as a football fan, I think that it's been a long time coming and is long overdue.
Okay, well, I'm pleased to say that the podcast industry remains entirely unregulated, and I am available to the highest bidder at any given moment. My email address is on my website. But in the meantime, my thanks to Emma, Arion and Kari for their stories. We will be back next week, and remember, you can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.